Hello, and in this part 2 video I'm going to describe a good law in your country, and you should say what the law is, how you learned about this law, who is affected by this law, and explain why you think this is a good law. Now, it's quite difficult to find a law that is exactly the same in each country, but I hope I've picked one that most countries have. There are a few countries that don't have this law, and I apologise if you come from one of those. But remember, IELTS isn't a test of truth, so you could still talk about this law. I've chosen to talk about a law which has made life much better for me for a number of reasons, which I will explain later. This is the law that banned smoking in all public places. By public places, this means workplaces, eating and drinking establishments, basically any place where the general public goes. Off the top of my head, I can't recall when it was introduced. I'm guessing it was around a decade ago now. I can vividly remember a time before this regulation was introduced, and eating out was a nightmare for me because of the smoke. I am allergic to the smell of smoke. It makes my eyes dry, my nose itch, and my throat sore. So in the past, if I was in a restaurant which became particularly smoky, I had to leave. Before the law was passed, we were told about it on TV, and there were advertisements in magazines, newspapers, etc. So there was quite a lot of warning before it was enacted. The reason why it took a few months to start was that some places, such as workplaces, needed to provide alternative smoking places, such as smoking shelters, outside where smokers are allowed to smoke. Obviously, the individuals who are most affected by this law are the smokers. I imagine that it is a struggle for chain smokers, and I don't know how they manage on long-haul flights. The positive knock-on effect of this law is that many chose to quit smoking. The government provides support and nicotine patches for those who want to give up, which is good. There are many reasons why this law is a positive step forward, too many to mention. The fact that children are not being exposed to as much second-hand smoking is the best thing about it. Passive smoking is a killer, and it affects not only kids. For example, substances in cigarettes can cause an attack in a person who has asthma, and anyone with respiratory problems should not be around second-hand smoke. Personally, I would love to see a total ban on smoking, but I doubt that will ever happen. But here's hoping. So let's take a look at some of the language. It's always good to start with a present perfect because it's a tense that not many IELTS candidates can use well. So I've chosen to talk about, or I've decided to talk about. Eating and drinking establishments. I'm just trying to use a wider range of vocabulary here instead of saying restaurants and pubs. Eating and drinking establishments. Basically. So we use basically a lot in English, and it's like saying simply. The general public, very useful for speaking and writing instead of using people. Now, this is a very complex idiomatic expression, not for use in IELTS writing, but very useful in IELTS speaking, because you often get asked things and you don't know the answer immediately. You would need to think about it or research it. So off the top of my head, I'm saying without researching it, without giving it much thought, off the top of my head, so very useful for IELTS speaking. So off the top of my head, I can't recall when it was introduced. Don't just say it was introduced in 1999, because that's boring and it's not as good a language. So off the top of my head, I can't recall when it was introduced. Recall means remember. And instead of saying I think all the time, we can say I'm guessing. A decade, 10 years ago. Now, instead of just saying I can remember, I can vividly remember. Vivid means bright. Vividly means brightly, clearly. So I can clearly remember. I can vividly remember. Now you're talking about a law, so you need other words for talking about law, and another word is a regulation. A nightmare. We often, in speaking, describe things as being a nightmare. It's very informal. We wouldn't use it so much in IELTS writing. Something's a nightmare. It's a big problem. I am allergic to. So some people are allergic to nuts. Some people are allergic to penicillin. And it means when your body has a bad reaction to something. So when I smell smoke, it makes my eyes dry, my nose itch. That means it's very uncomfortable and you want to scratch it. And my throat's sore, my throat hurts. Maybe you're not allergic to it, but you can say some people are allergic to the smell of smoke. It makes their eyes dry, their noses itch, their throats sore. And when you're in a place where there's lots of smoke, we describe it as being smoky. So quite a few passives in here was introduced. We were told. Warning is when you're told in advance about something. And another word for the introduction of laws, we say a law is enacted. So before it was enacted. So to enact a law means to introduce a law. Alternative smoking places means different, other smoking places. Alternative. And these are what you now see in my country. You see smoking shelters, and so these are designated places for smokers to go where they are allowed to smoke, often outside of office buildings, for example. We use the word obviously a lot in English when something's very obvious, very clear. So obviously the individuals who are most affected are the smokers. So these are the people who smoke. It's a struggle, very useful for writing and speaking. Something that's hard, something that is difficult is a struggle. Chain smokers are people who smoke a cigarette and as soon as they finish, they start another cigarette. So they're smoking maybe 40 cigarettes a day. This is a chain smoker. And if you're on a long haul flight, this is usually a flight over about 7 to 8 hours. A shorter flight, like 2 to 4 hours, we would call a short haul flight. Now often you need to talk about or write about in IELTS writing things that happen as a result of something else. So this is a useful phrase. A knock-on effect. So one thing happens and then another thing happens as a result. A knock-on effect. And we have a few verbs to mean to stop smoking. We've got to quit smoking and to give up smoking. And these here, this patch, which is a bit like a plaster that you put on your arm, is called a nicotine patch. The chemical in cigarettes that people are addicted to is nicotine. So if you wear this patch, then it gives you a certain amount of nicotine and stops you needing the cigarette. And here for those people, so you don't need to say the people, we can just say for those, because I'm referring back to the chain smokers, the people who smoke a lot. A positive step forward, rather than just saying it's good. It's a positive step forward. We talk about things being a step forward, which is progress, or a step backwards, which is not progress, it's going in the wrong direction. And we talk about people being exposed to smoke, especially if other people are smoking. So it's in the air, you're exposed to it. And we have some very good grammar here, and not being exposed to it. And there are two ways of describing this smoke. You can call it second-hand smoking, or you can call it passive smoking, because you're not actively smoking, it's passive smoking. Substances, this means things, chemicals in cigarettes. And here we've got a very serious illness that people can die from. If you have asthma, you struggle to breathe, and particularly if you're getting stressed or you're exposed to smoke, you can have an asthma attack, and this means you are really struggling to breathe and people can die from an asthma attack. So it can be very dangerous. Anybody with asthma should not smoke at all. Now, any illnesses that are connected with breathing and the lungs are called respiratory problems or respiratory diseases. Very useful if you're writing an essay on this topic. Respiratory diseases, respiratory problems, because it's due to respiration, which is breathing. A total ban, a complete ban, so it's not allowed at all. I doubt, if you doubt something, you don't believe it will happen. And I keep using this one. You are only going to do one part 2. So if I can keep repeating vocabulary in a few of these videos, then hopefully you'll remember to use it. Here's hoping. Another way of saying, I really hope this will happen. Hope you found that useful. There are some very useful words that you can use in IELTS writing as well, but not the idiomatic expressions such as off the top of my head. That is a great expression though for a part 2, and one that you could probably get in because you are having to think in the exam and you're not doing any research. So off the top of my head, you could use that in a part 2 or a part 3. So go through this a few times because there are quite a lot of vocabulary in this, such as chain smokers, knock-on effect, positive step forward, passive smoking, second-hand smoking, respiratory problems, asthma, etc. So there's a lot of very useful vocabulary for this topic. Just like to add that in the IELTS Speaking Workbook that you can download from the course, if you're struggling to download it, check your downloads folder to see if it is in there. This is a quite large workbook that Ian and I wrote a couple of years ago with the speaking topics at that time, but what we find is that a lot of the speaking topics are recycled, and there is a topic in there, describe a law. And in there we talk about the death penalty. Now I decided to do a new video and a more appropriate one, I think, than talking about the death penalty, which is not a law that is in every country. However, there are a lot of part 3 answers in there, and for example for this topic you've got 6 part 3 questions and answers, so very useful to take a look at that and look at the kinds of questions they'll be asking and the kinds of things that you could talk about. Hope you found that useful. Thanks for watching.